Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Um, to this morning's learning is sponsored by Judy and Louis Morris in memory of Judy's brother, Rafal Ben Akiva's Yortzeit was the 9th of Iyar. Should be a schus for his neshama. Okay, beginning with chapter 22, verse 27. Chapter 22, verse 27. We were discussing yesterday laws involving blemishes. That's an issue for the Kohanim serving in the base of Mikdash. That's also an issue for the animals that one would want to bring on the Mizbeach. And now the pasuk tells us, "Shor okasav ki voled." If one of these animals that can, the species that can be brought as a korban, give birth, vayashivas yamim tachas imo, and the baby needs to stay with its mother for 7 days. And then from the 8th day and on, can be brought as a sacrifice. Verse 28, you're not allowed to slaughter an animal and its child on the same day, mother and its child on the same day. Verse 29, when you bring a Thanksgiving offering, it should bring favor for you, and there's a certain parameter of time in which it may be eaten. Okay, a lot of different things, a lot of different details over here. You sort of have to ask yourself, is this just a miscellaneous list of things? So it's a very interesting sforno. Sforno on pasuk chav zayin, shoro chesed. Achar shehizker kol minei amumim bekachim. After we've gone through all these different types of blemishes with korbanos, and we clarify that they may not be used on the altar. He raises a very good point. There can be times where there's a big animal that has a small blemish, and it's worth a whole lot more than an animal that's small without a blemish. Doesn't matter. You're still not allowed to bring the offering that has the blemish. Sometimes, for all you know, the thing that halacha sees as a blemish might even be considered positive in the eyes of flesh and blood. So let's just pose as a question. Why should it be that a blemish renders an animal invalid for an offering? Shouldn't we look at the total? Shouldn't we say, wow, maybe all things being equal, if I have two animals to choose from, I should stay away from the one that has a blemish if they're of similar size or value? He says that's not the point. The point is, Hatsur Tamim Palo, that God is perfect. And since God is perfect, when we come before him, obviously we can never be perfect in our offering. It's impossible. But our being diligent about bringing animals that don't have what he renders a blemish is symbolic of trying to be complete in our service of Hashem. It's not about how much the animal is worth. That's really not the point. We're trying as best we can to emulate God, whether it be in the likeness of the animal, whether it be in the mode of the person bringing the offering. Amar shekmo came binyan gvul hasmanim shehikbil, halav ein lahosef, umimenu ein ligroa. It's not only true, says the Sforno, for blemishes on an animal or lack thereof. It has to do with parameters of time that God says the animal has to. There are certain details about the time that dictates what happens with the animal in terms of its offering. Vizkir iser mechusar zman. Visar shchita sosovias b'no b'yom echad. Visar b'achsheva schutz l'zman afilu b'kachim kalim. The Torah goes through all these different things that if the animal hasn't been in this world long enough, it's invalid. If it's being slaughtered on the same day as its mother, it's invalid. If the person who brought the offering had in mind that the accompanying laws for how long the animal could be eaten for are different than the actual halachos, it's invalid. And we say rules about the korban toda also. But what this really all speaks to, and it's a very interesting thing to think about in our service of God, is God makes rules. And some of the rules are meaningful to us. Some of the rules are not so meaningful, not so understood by us. But the point is, what we're trying to do is we're trying to serve him appropriately. And part of that are things like the fact that the animal doesn't have a blemish, is a way of exemplifying the fact that we understand, demonstrating that we understand that God is perfect in his own way. That's interesting to think about. Okay, let's go on to verse 32. Verse 32, don't desecrate my holy name, and I will be sanctified among the Jewish people. Ani Hashem b'kadeschem. I am Hashem who brings you holiness. It seems to be redundant. Don't desecrate my name, and I should be sanctified. It seems to be saying more or less the same thing in different ways from a positive and negative angle. It's a very interesting Ramban on this. It's the second Ramban on Pasuk Lamed Beis, maybe. It's the last Ramban in this parak, if that helps you. V'nikdash b'soch b'nei Yisrael. Al das rabosenu mitzvah saseh. The rabbis teach this is a positive mitzvah. Shenekares es shmo b'mitzvos leharig alein v'lo navor. This is the mitzvah of Yeharig v'lo yavor. We said last week v'chai b'hem that the general principle is that if one's life is in danger, one should save one's life, preserve one's life, even if that means one doesn't follow the standard halachos. But there's an exception. There are two exceptions. There's a list of specific sins that we're supposed to be willing to give up our life for. Not worshiping idols, not having illicit sexual relations, not murdering. And then there's also this famous idea that if it's a time of Shmad, if it's a time where there are people specifically trying to get us as a group to leave Judaism, then the smallest of things we have to be ready to give up our lives for. And in any event, this idea of being willing to die, al kiddush Hashem, being willing to die because you're asking me to do something that I'm not able to do, the rabbis teach is what's being discussed in this second phrase in the pasuk. And I should be sanctified within the Jewish people. That's why the next pasuk begins, that God took us out of Egypt to be for us a God. Shutam yichlol kol mitzvos. That's a very broad idea. That every single mitzvah, if it's appropriate in context, every single mitzvah is fit to sanctify God's name over. We're God's servants. That he redeemed us from Egypt. So just an interesting thing to think about on a seemingly relatively mundane verse, at least it seems that way. Okay, going on to chapter 23, verse 2. God says to Moshe, Daber b'nei Yisrael v'yamar aleichem, speak to the Jewish people and tell them, Moadei Hashem asher tikru'u osam mikroi kodesh, the holidays of God, that you will declare them to be declarations of holiness. Elohim moadoi. These are my holidays. This is a laning that probably had it at some point over Pesach, if I'm not mistaken. It's a regular Yom Tov laning. It goes through the different holidays. Now, it's a little bit difficult to understand. I mean, I'm all for holidays. Nice if I didn't have to work on them, but that's me. What does this have to do with this parsha? This parsha is about the Mishkan, the Beis Hamikdash, and Kohanim. It's very nice these are the holidays, but how does this fit in over here? So let's see the Ramban on Pasuk Beis. Ramban on Pasuk Beis, Daber b'nei Yisrael. Ein leKohanim esek binyan hamoados, yoser me'asher liYisrael b'hem. The Kohanim don't have any special connection to Yom Tovim more than the Jewish people do. Okay, lo hiskir b'parashas Aaron u'banav. Unlike many other introductory verses or phrases in this parsha and in other parshas, it doesn't say speak to Aaron and his sons, because this is not an Aaron and his sons discussion. This is a Klal Yisrael discussion. So it says speak to the Jewish people. Rak b'nei Yisrael sheyichlo is kulam ke'echad, that we're including all of them as one. Kilo yifaresh korbanos hamusafim b'parsha azos. We're not even talking about the offerings. In other words, if in Parshas Pinchas it talks about the special Musaf offering of each Yom Tov, oh, that's a Kohen thing. But we're not even discussing that here. Aval hiskir hamoadim kan b'toras kohanim ba'avur shehem yemei hakorbanos. We're still discussing the Yom Tovim here because they are days of offerings. V'yirmos alei posha amar v'kravtem ishel Hashem. V'yamar b'sof haparsha elam moadei Hashem asher tikru osam mikrei kodesh lakriv ishel Hashem olah umincha zevach unsachim. at the end of this whole discussion, it says, these are the days of God, that you will bring on these days offerings. So even though we're not even going into what the offerings are here, we know there are special korbanos of the Yom Tovim. Avalo herich levor hamusafim. So, okay, so the reason why these psukim are here is because there's this unique korban tie-in on these days. So now let's pose a new question. So why doesn't the Torah discuss the korban musaf here? Every holiday has a special korban musaf. It's discussed in Parshas Pinchas. If the reason it's being discussed here is there's a unique korban aspect for the holidays, tell me what they are. Tell me what the korbanos are. God didn't want to go to length here to discuss the musaf offerings. A very interesting thing. God didn't want the Jewish people to bring them in the desert. Only once he designates who are the people who are going to split up the land in Israel, who are the heads of tribes that are going to work on this. So once that designation has been made, then he talks about the musaf offerings. This is all in the book of Bamidbar. V'alkein amar b'yom kippurim vayas kasher tzivu Hashem es Moshe she'asa kain b'Midbar. By Yom Kippur, it says that Aaron did like Hashem commanded Moshe, because all of the Yom Kippur instructions that Hashem gave Moshe were observed in the desert. So it's very interesting. So he says the Yom Tovim are in play in the desert, but the offerings of the Yom Tovim are not. And actually, he says, even though it describes in the psukim here, offerings have to do with Yashan and Chadash and the Korban Omer and things of that sort, those weren't brought in the desert, but they're obviously connected to the growing of crops. It has to do with what crops are allowed, and therefore it's obviously only in play once they get into the land of Israel in an agricultural setting. So that's why those are mentioned. Vizkir Shabbos Moadei Hashem shetikru osam mikroi kodesh shgamu yom moed nikro osam mikra kodesh. It's interesting. Shabbos is on the list. If Shabbos is the first day mentioned, that's also considered a holy sacred day. Okay, so that's just an interesting thing to think about. Now let's jump ahead, skip a paragraph in the Ramban, and go to the next Ramban, Mikroi Kodesh, declarations of holiness. What does that phrase even mean? Declarations of holiness. Shigiu bayom hazeh kulam kruim v'ne'asafim l'kadesh oso. That everyone should be gathered to sanctify the day on these holidays. Ki mitzvah hi al Yisrael, it's a mitzvah on the Jewish people, li kavetz b'beis Elokim, to gather in the house of God, b'yom moed, on the designated day, l'kadesh hayom, to sanctify the day, b'farhesia, publicly, b'tfilah, v'halel l'kel, b'ksus nikia, to say special praises to Hashem, to be dressed in a special way, v'lasos oso yom mishta, and to make the day a day of celebration. Just an interesting thing to think about. That's how the Ramban understands the phrase Mikra Kodesh, that Ra means to call, that everyone is called together to celebrate this special day. So the Sforno spoke about the whole idea of blemishes with offerings and Korbanos and Kohanim, excuse me. The Ramban spoke about the mitzvah of dying al Kiddush Hashem. And the Ramban also spoke about why the Torah would discuss holidays here in this place. And we briefly had the Ramban regarding why the Yom Tovim are called Mikra Kodesh, declaration of holiness.